Yes, Amanda, I know a lot of parents are excited about the prospect of returning to in-person learning, and I know a lot of districts are considering that right now here in Maine. Okay, it's 9:03, so we are going to get started. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Maine Parent Federation and Gear Parent Network are offering our 4th annual conference. This year, we're coming to you virtually in response to the safety protocols for COVID-19. Maine Parent Federation and Gear Parent Network are 2 of your family organizations within the state, and we both offer information, resources, referrals, and peer-to-peer assistance for free to all of our families in Maine. Maine Parent Federation provides information and assists families of children with disabilities and/or special healthcare needs, and we assist families navigate all systems of care, including state services, medical services, and school systems. Gear Parent Network provides information and assists in navigating mental health services in our state for families of children with mental health diagnoses. Throughout the next 2 weeks, both of our agencies have collaborated to bring you information to assist you in navigating everything related to the pandemic. Before I introduce our presenters today, just a few housekeeping items. We are recording this webinar. We are also live streaming it on Facebook. We'll be offering the webinar recorded on Facebook and on our website and our YouTube channel for those of you who would like to watch again or those that are unable to attend today live. Please use our chat box for any questions. I will be monitoring it and will attempt to answer them as we go when I feel the question is prudent to the discussion, but we'll also provide the opportunity for both Michelle and Becki to answer the questions at the end of the session. With that, I'd like to welcome you back to our in-person learning. This webinar is designed to include education on how to prepare your student and their IEP for back to in-person learning, how to evaluate their new present levels of performance, how to ask for the proper services, and how to gain access back into the general education setting. Our presenters this morning are a UNH professor and certified adaptive physical education instructor, Dr. Michelle Grenier. Michelle is an internationally recognized expert in the field of inclusion and adaptive physical education. And joining her is Becki Belmore, a Greely Middle School teacher for 4th and 5th grade in physical education, and she is also an adaptive physical education coordinator. So with that, I will turn it over to Becki and Michelle. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Carrie.
Good morning.
Great. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Carrie, for that. We are excited to be here to present to you. Most importantly, I hope that we provide you with some information and tools to enable you to advocate on behalf of your child, particularly during this time of transition and so much change. So Becki and I are really thrilled to be here, and thank you, Carrie, for the invitation. All right, so in this session, we are going to go over a few things. We'll go next, Becki.
All right, there we go.
Okay, great. So overview of this presentation, we're going to introduce ourselves, a little background information. I am, as I said, really excited to be presenting with Becki, who's in the schools, a practitioner, and I think that really lends some authenticity to what we're trying to present here. We're going to look at what inclusion actually means, and as part of that discussion, is when we consider back to in-person learning, the least restrictive environment is always a touch point. So we're going to understand some facets of, particularly if we're looking at peer-supported placements, because many of our students and your children have been not engaging in the peers the way that you would want to. So we're going to look at, if you're advocating or we're looking at returning to face-to-face, what are some of the things that you want to pay attention to within the physical education setting? Becki's going to talk about the IEP process. We're going to provide a few case studies, and we're really looking forward to a great discussion with questions and concerns at the end.
Quick question, Michelle and Becki. Are you able to provide the PowerPoint to me so I can give it to those that are interested in receiving it after the presentation?
Yes, it's a Google slide, so we should be able to do that.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to introduce myself. Carrie did a good job with that as well. I am a professor at the University of New Hampshire, and I've been here a long time. I started as a physical education teacher and was always interested in my students who had disabilities. It's like, how do I make this work? How do I make it work for them? And this was back in the time just about IDEA. So kids were separated, and I've gone through that process of watching the evolution of mainstreaming into inclusion. I'm also president of NCPED, which is our National Consortium for Physical Education for Individuals with Disabilities. And I also, if you have questions beyond this, the organization has a strong advocacy component. So I would recommend going to the website. There's Ask a Question, and we lobby teachers across the country and professors across the country just to advocate on your behalf. So that's another resource for you. Becki.
Good morning, everyone. I have been in public education now for 27 years, all teaching physical education and adapted physical education. My interest in adapted PE came from an experience with a general education colleague telling a student who uses a wheelchair that he had to sit in the corner of the gymnasium and observe class. And I wanted to make sure that I was educating myself in a way that that was not happening in my class, and that those students were fully included and integrated within the general education setting. So inclusion is very important to me. I also see some of my students in a direct service one-on-one or small group setting. I am also representing the Maine Adapted PE Task Force, a group here in our state that is advocating for services in adapted physical education for students in public schools. And I also represent adapted physical education on the Mayford Executive Board, our state association for health and physical education teachers.
Thank you, Becki. That's wonderful. I appreciate that story too, about where you what sort of got you going. And many of these stories get us going as well. We're going to show a 6-minute video after I go through this slide. And what I want you to consider in this slide, and it's kind of it's a tutorial to some extent on inclusion. And as we return to face-to-face or in-person learning, some of the considerations you'll see evident in this video. One term I use all the time, both my students everywhere, is what's a natural support. And when we look at natural supports, we look at peers. And again, what we've lost during COVID is a lot of that socialization, that experience with our peers. So within this video, although it's pre-COVID, so things will look a little bit different when we return, but still consider the natural supports. Also consider the program goals as you look through this. So what is the teacher trying to teach? What are the overall learning for both students with and without disabilities? And I think we're looking at context here, and these are the facets that are really important for context if we want to have a healthy program. School outcomes, one of the benefits of this is when you've got a great phys ed program that's inclusive in consideration of students with and without disabilities, it is infectious throughout the school. So there's also positive outcomes that. And then again, that question of who benefits, and everybody benefits. So we're going to play this video. It's of a school right around the corner from me in Dover, New Hampshire. It's a unified physical education program. It's at a high school setting. And again, we'll follow that with discussion on the least restricted environment and what all of this means. So again, look at natural supports and just take down notes. Happy to have you chat regarding any comments or thoughts with the video. Thanks, Becki.
Head, elbow, head, waist, Physical activity has the power to improve the physical, mental, and emotional well-being of our youth, both now and in the future. Yet children and youth with intellectual disabilities show lower levels of physical activity and higher rates of obesity and other chronic conditions when compared to their peers without intellectual disabilities. At the National Fitness Foundation, we believe that every child deserves a lifetime of health and fitness. Quality physical education can help to equip all children with the knowledge, skills, and abilities to be fit for life. We heard from thousands of physical educators who want strategies to ensure that their physical education classroom welcomes and benefits all students. With funding from Special Olympics International, we traveled to Dover High School in Dover, New Hampshire, to observe their approach to inclusive physical education. Their program, called Unified Wellness, engages students with and without intellectual disabilities in the physical education classroom. So what do we mean by inclusion?
I think our gym class is super duper special because there's a lot of different people all coming together and we're working together and doing all the same stuff.
You see everyone around you will do like push-ups or sit-ups, and there's really no one consistently who will just sit back and not do it. They see everyone around them trying,
It's just a desire to reach everybody in your school.
Simply put, inclusion is the provision of learning environments where students with disabilities are engaging with their peers without disabilities and are able to access and participate in the physical education curriculum in meaningful ways.
My favorite sport is basketball. I like being on the team and helping them out. I feel like I'm raised strong and faster. Being part of the Untitled Wellness makes me stronger.
Inclusive physical education benefits the health and well-being of students with intellectual disabilities. And there are ripple effects benefiting their peers without disabilities, the school community, and the community at large.
Caleb is 18, and what's amazing is as each year has gone on, and he has developed those skills just like any kid would, he has gotten better. And soccer this year, after 4 years of it, was just amazing. He was going after the ball, he was getting goals. You know, he has his friends there supporting him, and the confidence level has just blossomed for him, and it's been amazing. And, you know, I don't even have to pick him up after practice. He gets rides home from his friends. You know, he's got these wonderful friendships, and they're like, oh yeah, we'll give Caleb a ride home, no problem. He goes and hangs out with them and goes and gets pizza. He has, you know, typical relationships with his peers that he's met through these programs.
Unified has changed the whole atmosphere at Dover. Everyone's accepting of everybody else. There's no longer a table for some kids and a table for another in the cafeteria. And that's one thing that a parent had realized. She came in to drop something off of her student. She looked in the cafeteria and she started crying. She goes, my student's not at that table anymore. They're all integrated. And that's one thing that Unified actually really changes in the whole community.
Dover High School's story shows how inclusive physical education can prepare all students to be active and fit for life. How can you make this your story?
I think we learn best from our peers, peer modeling, and any way that you can incorporate peers working together, whether they have a disability or not.
So my biggest thing is having each kid be independent, whether it's a mentor trying to help them without instruction from me or a mentee learning from their peer rather than from us, constantly an older adult teaching them, because I do feel like they learn more from their peers. They don't really care what we have to say in high school, you know, teenagers.
My son's name is Oliver. He's a junior here and he has Down syndrome. He was not physically active. He didn't enjoy sports. He didn't like to run around. He didn't want to. He didn't see any reason to. But now he runs and he jumps and he plays volleyball, which is just amazing to see him out there, and his stamina has improved. I think the biggest motivator for him in becoming more active was the other students. They're high-fiving and they're cheering each other on, and he just absolutely thrives. And I think that that perspective is going to help him remain fit for life, because he's going to constantly want to be doing things that he didn't think he could or he didn't want to do before. He's got confidence and excitement, and now I think that he will be pursuing much more physical types of activities than he ever would have before.
Our job as educators is to make either a skill easier or harder. So how do we, progressions or regressions? Like, what's the right piece of equipment that's going to work for somebody who has to catch a ball like this or catch a ball like that? If someone isn't kicking a moving ball, for example, let's make it a stationary ball.
Can you show us a traditional push-up? Perfect. Justin showing us wall push-ups. Do another one.
You know, you want them to be successful so that they will continue to engage in physical activity throughout their lifespan. Take a look. Is there a paraprofessional there to support you? Is there a peer who can support you? A lot of times you can get the therapeutic services, physical therapy, OT, who can come in and support you with their sort of mutually reinforcing goals. Whether it is a physical limitation and speaking to them, speaking to their therapist, speaking to the guidance, or it's socially, talking to the parents, talking to the students themselves. You know, what's making everybody tick?
At Dover High School, inclusion began with a single idea: have students with and without intellectual disabilities participate in physical education together. By providing peer support, activity and assessment options, and supportive resources, fitness is going well beyond the classroom to build lifelong habits.
Oh, whoa. Fitness is going beyond just class. I see students bowling. I see students doing fitness activities outside the building that they never did before. And that's huge. That's huge.
So fitness is foundational. Let's not limit it to just, the things that we do with machines or the plyometrics. Let's apply it across the board so that we can increase and promote and enhance quality of life for all individuals.
Thank you, Becki. And we'll just slide back to that previous slide. And Carrie, if you have any outstanding comments, I'd like to hear them.
Sure. We have one comment, and it says, one of my son's favorite days of the week is when he has PE. He misses parachutes, throwing, kicking balls, and being able to burn his extra energy. 7-year-old boy with ADHD. And I think a lot of districts moved away from UAs when we went into the pandemic. So I think a lot of kids are missing that activity. Somebody else, it's great to see the wonderful things Dover High is doing. This is my old high school. The other thing I'd like to add is just, I know this highlighted physical education, but all the strategies that you saw in this video can be applied to any classroom, not just physical education. And it will be just as contagious in your school system. How are these exercises measured to monitor progress year over year with different PE teachers taking the measurements?
Well, this is one physical education teacher who is a consistent figure in this program. So consistency would be a good question, particularly if you're coming from middle to high school. And I could say potentially that is a challenge for many teachers, particularly when you have teachers who, one school and one program. But we are going to talk about assessments and the use of assessments. So if we could have consistent assessments across the board and folders that follow students within the physical education setting or adapted physical education setting, that would helpfully ensure consistency across the board. I hope I did a good job answering that question, but we'll get to that a little bit later to the IEP process and the assessment process.
And I think, Michelle, too, parents could advocate for that in an IEP. So an assessment that's being used at one school or from one grade to the next, you could advocate for that assessment to be continued in the IEP if it's working. One last comment, my son did unified basketball when he was at Brewer. He loved it and made some great friends.
Again, that whole point of lifelong physical activity, physical education is designed as both a, a K-12 experience, but the whole idea is that you want to continue being physically active on multiple levels. So we're going to look at that. Becki, we can slide forward. I think the whole idea of natural supports, and that's one of the things about face-to-face learning, that getting back to face-to-face learning is, many of our children have been in isolation. So what can we advocate for so they do have access both to the curriculum, as you saw in this video, and their peers. So we'll go forward, Becki, to the least restrictive environment, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And this.
That's what I am raised, strong and fast.
There we go.
Great. And I think all this began with my conversation with Carrie, and her concerns about, her child and what this all means and this larger picture of the least restrictive environment. I think when we say adapted physical education, it's both something we may appreciate as parents and educators, but sometimes that means separation. It means separation from the mainstream population or the general population. So what we're going to do in these next couple of slides is really clarify what physical education is, and again, how you can advocate on behalf of your child, and looking at the least restrictive environment. So physical education, and sometimes they are specially designed, as you saw in that video. We can make our fitness components so they address the functional capacity of the student, and that specially designed physical education. So that specially designed physical education can occur in any setting. If I need to specially design certain things based on the assessment of my child, it doesn't mean that they need adapted physical education separate from their peers. It can be specially designed physical education in the general education setting. But really, it's arming the physical education teacher with specific knowledge about that student. One thing Becki and I really want to make clear is that physical therapy is not physical education, and physical therapy cannot replace physical education. So by law, physical education is a direct requirement, and physical therapy is an important piece. However, it's therapy, it's not physical education. And if you look back to that video, what gets provided in that physical education setting? So we want to really make that distinction that physical therapy should never replace physical education. Students should have both, but physical education is a direct requirement as defined under IDEA. So we can go on to the next slide, Becki. And what is physical education? Again, the distinction between therapy and physical education, it's motor skills, fundamental motor skills, catching, throwing, dancing, swimming. I know Becki has an aquatic program. Sometimes the schools have ski programs or snowshoeing. So it's really a multiple of individual, lifetime, and fitness activities. So that's what physical education is. And we start at the basics in the elementary school and we really try to develop skills, and then we narrow it down a little bit more in high school. So, and last piece there is affective skills may also be assessed. So we have a big affective component in this. We'll go on to the next slide, Becki. One thing I really want to reinforce here is as parents and as educators, we have 5 standards. Sometimes we see physical education as just skill oriented. And we think of our, a child, well, they should be able to throw a ball by a certain age. They should be able to skip. They should be able to jump. They should be able to move in a certain way. That really only addresses a small portion of physical education. That's standard number 1, skills. But we have standard number 2, which is moving in space. 3 is fitness. 4 and 5, I really reinforce, and particularly COVID and post-COVID, these are the areas that we're really focused on with kids coming back together, being with their peers, learning, getting back in the socialization of the school setting. Standard 4 is the physically literate individual exhibits responsible personal and social behavior. And again, that's one of the advantages of a physical education setting. Students are playing together and that they're working with each other, and the physical education teacher or adapted physical education teacher can really teach those pro-social skills inside of that environment. And then finally, unless you're in that environment, we want you to continue, as we saw, Fit for Life. We want you to enjoy physical education and take that with you through the rest of your life, because as we know, often students with disabilities and individual disabilities have lower levels of health and fitness. So how can physical education support that physical activity throughout the lifespan? Okay, and the next 2 slides, we're just going to delve into the least restrictive environment, because we think, again, that that's an important piece of what specialized services are or adapted physical education is. And the least restrictive environment basically means, as you all know, what is the best and optimal setting for my child. And I can say that you'll take the same child and you can go in one school district and you're going to have you may potentially have a different setting for physical education based on assessments, the team, who makes those determinations. So the least restrictive environment is a tricky term, and it's kind of context dependent. As you saw at Dover High School, all of those students are in what I would call a modified physical education, mixed abilities, MPE. So it's a peer supported. And that's a really ideal program, particularly at the high school level. I think that's probably the most popular class on campus. There's a waiting list to get into that class, and you both for not students with disabilities, but students without disabilities. So that is considered one facet of the least restrictive environment. To the left in the GPE, the general physical education, that is really, according to IEDA, unless specified in the IEP, students should be in or have access to the general physical education setting. So again, a stipulation of IDEA. And Becki will talk a little bit about that. We have other options too for the least restrictive environment. You may have really a child with identified need, or a student, and that small group or class of students, or even a one-on-one with the APE, the general physical education, that can really support that child. Sort of oftentimes if they can pre-teach and have both the small group and a general physical education setting, that is ideal when you've got this sort of booster, this extra boost of individualized instruction in a small setting in preparation for the larger general physical education setting. And then you can have some combination of all. So again, those lines, they're not walls between each of those components of the least restrictive environment. Students can travel between. One thing that the literature does bear out is when students are pulled out and sort of separated out, it can be a little bit more of a challenge to get them into the general physical education setting or a peer supported setting. So again, we're advocating when you look at your goals and what you want for your child and IDEA, they should have access to the general physical education setting unless there's some requirement need not to do that. But these are permeable walls that can change. Students can move, and it can be context dependent and also curriculum dependent. That's long-winded, but hopefully we had some valuable information.
Michelle, can I just jump in for a quick second? I just want to, and Becki, can you go back to that previous slide? Because I just want to emphasize that everything that Michelle is talking about and applying here can be applied to every single academic setting. So not just the physical education setting. This just is Michelle and Becki's area of expertise, but the concepts that they're presenting to you here today are concepts which can be applied for every single academic setting that your child will be participating in or is participating in. I think what's also important to remember is that during this pandemic, the least restrictive environment for a lot of our students has been non-existent, because if you're 100% remote at home, I know that's not our least restrictive environment in our house. And so for most students with disabilities, it's probably not your least restrictive environment. It's the most safe environment for your student right now. And then students who are in person, who may have been, we had a lot of districts across the state offer more in-person days to students with disabilities. But what that meant for them was that they were placed in a silo segregated special education setting where they had 100% of special education students. In order to maintain the cohorts, which I know the CDC and MDOE recommended to our districts. And that's not a least restrictive environment, but that was the environment that was deemed the safest. And for some families, they needed that in-person learning, so they made a decision that that was the best option. So as you transition back to in-person and you make the decision for your family that it is safe for your child to return to the general education setting, and it is safe for them to be in contact with other students, keep these systems in mind, what Michelle and Becki is presenting to you, because all four of these options are available to your child for every academic setting. It's you advocating for them. And what we want to make sure doesn't happen is that the silos which your child has been placed in doesn't become their least restrictive environment when we do return to in-person. If it wasn't that way before, it shouldn't be that way after.
Thank you, Carrie. And Becki, you might speak to, the safety protocols that have been in place for our teachers. I know spraying down equipment, social distancing, whether you deem that safe, but I think teachers also, as we're looking for reentry, have to have safety protocols in place within their classes so that it is a safe learning environment.
Right.
Becki,
And I was going to speak to that in a later slide, in that my district, for example, has offered 4-day in-person instruction to students with disabilities, and families opted for that. Some opted to stay at 2 days a week, as the general education offering has been proposed, and some have chosen to be 100% remote. So it is really important to think about, as we re-enter, what that looks like for your child, and getting back into their typical settings as quickly as possible. Also realizing that the accommodations and supports might look a little different in September than they did last March. And as this Michelle and both Carrie spoke to, this is I like that word, permeable. It can change, and it can change frequently.
Thank you, Becki. Again, this next slide is going to reinforce the adapted physical education placement. So what we're trying to do is dispel adapted PE does not mean separate and silo. It means services and supports is really what it is. And if you have, even in the general physical education setting, as you look at the IEP process, what are those services and supports that will need to be put in place in order for your child to access whichever environment is deemed the most important? But the general physical education class, if you look the least restrictive to most restrictive, you've got a GPE class, general phys ed. And again, I assume, Carrie, that this can apply across the board to all general education settings. You've got general physical education with accommodations and modifications. So within that GPE setting, what specific interventions and or strategies are we utilizing and or supports to support that student. Becki is an APE consult and an APE teacher, and she's a GPE teacher. Win-win situation, particularly when you have someone who's knowledgeable of a specific either teaching strategies or tailored to that child. So that's another least restrictive option, but again, they're in the general physical education. And then you might have a GPE with a more GPE and APE, where you've got both general physical education, but also supported small environment, okay? And then you could have just a separate APE class. So, and that would be the least restrictive, but it may be the best option for some students. Again, we're not passing judgment on what is best, but I think assessments, supports in place, knowledge of the teacher, the general physical education teacher, you know, professional development. What is it he or she can actually do to improve his or her learning environment to make the program more accessible for students with disabilities? We oftentimes put it on the student, but let's have physical education take some responsibility as well. Remember that story that Becki started with about what, you know, sort of got her going. So, and again, NICP and myself, if you're looking for more context specific support, and or Becki, the AP task force, we can provide those things. We have a inclusion rating scale that examines the physical education environment that could also support PE teachers. So Becki, we'll go on to the next slide. I think this is where Becki takes over and her knowledge of the IEP process.
I am going to speak to this one. And a couple of things have already been mentioned and discussed a bit, but I'm sure you're all very familiar with the IEP process. And we can use this IEP process as we begin to think about reintroduction into the general education setting and back to in-person learning. Those supports that were in place back in March may need to look different. Your LRE might look different in that first IEP details. It's important to take a look at the goals and objectives that are written into your student's IEP. This is what's driving instruction, not just in the physical education setting, but as Carrie's been mentioning, across the board in all academic areas, as well as in our related service areas. The service times that are mentioned into that section of the IEP, I include both my direct service time and my consultation time in services. I teach the general ed setting to only 4th and 5th grade in my district. I am in constant contact with the general education teachers at the middle school and the high school level. Early elementary students are coming onto my radar to have an eye on as their needs change over those early elementary years. And the consultation service, I would include in the IEP in my support of the general education teacher and relaying to them what individual students might need within their setting as the general education teacher. I'm going to speak to accommodations on a later slide, but it's also very important, as we've already said, that those accommodations probably have changed since last March. And we may need to add some accommodations, or students might be accessing their programming a little differently. Transition services as related to physical education. By high school, we're thinking about postgraduate time in adult services and being sure that students are exposed to community programming and have had access to those types of settings and knowing how to access lifelong learning and lifelong physical activity. Assessments we're going to speak to a little bit later as well, and the need for alternate assessments, and that can happen across the physical education setting as well. Let's see. So we wanted to just throw out a couple of examples of how your goals and objectives can address learning in physical education. I include my physical education and adapted PE goals under the instructional component of the IEP, broken down into both the annual goal and the short-term objective. This is a very simple example of a skill-based goal. That annual goal is long-term, as we mentioned, and that present level of performance is always very important to know. Where is your student starting at? And as we think about next year, present level of performance may have regressed a bit just due to lack of practice, lack of exposure, our very limited opportunities for practice. And then the short-term objective is your incremental steps in getting to the ultimate annual goal. So this was an example of a skill base. The next is a fitness-based example. Again, a very simple presentation of that. We know where a student is at based on their assessments, whether it's in their general ed setting or in their special ed setting, their annual goal to see improvement, and then their short-term objective. And I also wanted to mention, sometimes I write goals based on an overarching annual goal, maybe from parent input. They might like to see their student participating in community programs like Challenger League Baseball. And the annual goal may be to access that type of programming, with the short-term objective being each of the components that the student may need to be able to do to access that programming. So for example, Challenger Baseball, we're hitting a ball off a tee or off a modified pitch. The student needs to understand the concept of running the bases and then defense. So each of those components would be a short-term objective that we can spend time on over the course of the year. And by the end, be ready to participate in community-based programs like that.
Becki, I want to just speak to the piece. So we've seen a fitness goal and we've seen a skill-based goal. And remember, we introduced earlier on the 5 standards: skill, tactics, fitness, socialization. So there's nothing that says that a social goal cannot be written in here. Zoe will be able to interact with a peer partner for 75% of the time, with prompts and supports. So we can write those in as part of the IEP, focusing on social interaction, whether it's eye contact, whether it's reciprocity, giving and taking, partner turn taking. So again, physical education, that's why it has a big social component, and those type of goals can be written in, and particularly that IEP becomes a legal document where what needs, in order to meet the IEP goals, those where those can be met.
Good. I've written several goals. Oh, Carrie, did you have a?
No, it's okay. I was just going to emphasize the present level of performance that Becki spoke about, because I think as we do transition out of the pandemic, this spring, is whether your child's 100% virtual, hybrid, or in person, this spring is going to be the time for you to request of your school districts some assessments, and they don't have to be formal assessments. They can be informal assessments, and some of them can be done virtually, to address what your child's new present level of performance is. There is not one child who hasn't regressed in some area during this pandemic. All of our children, including typically developing children, whether it's academically, social and emotionally, physically, with fine motor skills, speech, all of those things, in maybe more than one area, our children are experiencing regression in. So for our children with IEPs, working with your school district to request, and I would be requesting IEP meetings of your school district or team meetings of your school district to request some informal assessments to talk about your child's present level of performance. And once those assessments are finished, an IEP meeting to create a new IEP for next year to address those new levels. Because they're all going to be different, and it may not be that every single service area looks different. It may be some minor tweaks, but those tweaks will make all the difference, especially in September.
And assessment can be done virtually as well.
Yes.
So we can assess physical skills, giving parents some tools ahead of time, running through some protocols for test, and then videotaping that and analyzing that. So because your child is a remote does not mean that we as educators cannot assess remotely. All right, so great.
So I'd like to speak to the collaboration between the adapted PE teacher, myself, and my physical therapist in my district. We have a very collaborative program. And by working together, we can meet student needs in that least restrictive environment. There's several models. My physical therapist in my district attends every adapted PE class that I teach. She's very involved in collaborative goal writing. We're increasing the depth of our instruction and what we're able to provide students by making sure that we're not repeating goals within the IEP. And again, emphasizing that the PE component is the curriculum, is the skills being taught, while the related service of physical therapists is making sure that that student is able to access and benefit from that curriculum.
Okay, we can go on to the next slide. And I'll speak to a little bit of this. Becki used that key term when we say access the physical education curriculum, which is really, really important. Typically, the goals that we have for our students with disabilities are not significantly different or different than we have for our students without disabilities. And they can be accomplished in that general physical education setting. Again, sort of pre-COVID, Sophie here is a student with a pretty significant medical needs. But what we have here is students working on flexibility. Sophie with her physical therapist is working on her flexibility as well. So in this, we have a coordinated effort by the physical education teacher and by the physical therapist to accomplish those goals within the setting. The nice thing about what this physical education teacher does is she will deliver the lesson plan ahead of time and the goals to the related service providers. So we have this kind of wraparound effect. They're working on the same goals in their physical therapy setting as Becki described earlier, and those can be reinforced in a physical education setting. It requires collaboration. I always say physical therapists, occupational therapists, and speech therapists have knowledge that we as physical education teachers or the general education teacher do not have, but we also have knowledge that they don't have, and we also have a peer supported environment that, you know, where a child really wants to be with their peers and engaging with their peers. So the shared goals, the collaboration, you know, we're not mutually exclusive of each other. And again, this is just a simple of example of a curriculum. And it's not just yoga. This can be striking, throwing, catching, target games, all of those things across the board in the curriculum. And again, this picture, it collaboration as we look at going into the IEP process and requesting assessments. It requires the support of everybody on the IEP team. Becki will speak to her involvement on an IEP as the direct service provider and or the adapted physical education environment. But we believe GPE teachers have information. Other people have information, but again, the more information we get, the more we can make our curriculum accessible to the students with disabilities so that we can bring them back and have knowledge about their specific skills. So we can address this both in the IEP and in our teaching.
One bit on this slide, and we've already spoken to it a little bit, is that this is where your accommodations come into place to support your student accessing the general education curriculum. And again, these things have probably changed over the past year, and it's important to know what additional supports may need to come into play. And that's through that collaboration, and the parent is a part of that collaboration too, to be sure that we have the appropriate things in place. And this is just the list of general accommodations that can be provided.
Michelle and Becki, can you address where recreational therapy as an IEP service fits in with regard to physical education services?
Recreational therapy is usually a community-based or clinical-based service that's not something provided within the school setting. That doesn't mean that there can't be communication between an outside provider and like for myself to, again, have a little collaboration and parent input on what they would like their child to be able to access, maybe activities that they access as a family. Is that where you're?
I got a question, so let's see if that provides some clarification. The individual has that question. If you could just let us know if that answered, and if not, just expand upon it. I would also just add, for outside therapists to be able to speak to school employees, which is highly recommended for whatever therapy you're receiving, usually a parent has to initiate that request, and it's going to require you to sign releases with both the school and the therapist. And typically with the school, it's the FERPA release because that's the privacy release for schools. And for the therapist, it's the HIPAA release because that's the medical release. So it can be a little overwhelming for parents, but if you initiate that request, then you would initiate it both with the school and with your private therapist, and they should have the releases available for you to sign.
I know that Northeast Passage, for example, pre-COVID would provide some of those recreational therapy goals to some students in a physical education setting. I mean, the challenge becomes, you know, is the rec therapy in lieu of physical education. I think when it can support physical education, it's a win-win situation. I have seen situations oftentimes when recreational therapy takes over. Again, it's that a therapy versus a direct service. So it can be a fine line, but I think a collaboration with a rec therapist can often reinforce those goals. Becki alluded to baseball, beat baseball, or any of those outside activities. So again, hopefully we answered part of that question. It should be part of that collaborative teaming. So we'll go on to, we've got this, but we wanted to share one resource. We've got, Carrie will get these resources in here, and C.A.P.E is the organization that I am president of, and we're happy to help you. C.A.P.E writes law, important information on physical education. Becki represents the Maine task force, Maine Adapted Sports and Recreation. And again, if you're looking at therapeutic recreation services, this is a great resource. And again, a part of the Center for Therapeutic Recreation. So before we go let's pull up that document, Becki, that we wanted to look at. And I'll just precede this. This is from Tony Bader, who is the Adapted PE coordinator in the Seattle Public Schools. And I thought this was a useful document. We can share this with the parents. When we look at IEP, when we look at assessments, this provides a kind of a synopsis of a number of things that we can pay attention to. So the first part of this document just talks about the variety of assessments. And we'll, you know, again, not one assessment will fit all. TGMD typically works for children, younger children, but we have the Brockport fitness test. And again, we'll look at authentic assessments as well. So we'll keep scrolling down, Becki, with that. Informal evaluation should be part of the complete picture. If you just assess on a physical skill, oftentimes, particularly given the regression of skill, we are going to see kids falling below their norms, but that's not the complete picture. So you want a teacher-made checklist, like what's important within their classroom. We'll show you an interest survey, observation within the GPE and or recess as well, so we can examine those social skills. And thanks, Becki. We'll keep this questionnaire intervention needs document. So again, it provides this collaborative tool, which services a student currently receiving PT, OT. Again, it starts to identify some of those key pieces. Is it locomotor, hand-eye coordination, fitness? So I think this will also help the physical education teacher, the adapted PE teacher, really target in specific areas of need. What are the areas of concern? You know, is it fitness? And we can keep scrolling down with this. Again, it provides some options. You know, what's the fitnessgram score? How can we provide some options? We'll keep going. And also, could be part of that IEP process. Like, what have you done? And particularly if you need to support the GPE teachers, what are some options here? You know, have you tried some of these to support peer, whether it's reinforcement, whether it's a visual schedule, whether it's choices? As we continue to scroll down, I think Becki speaks to this as well as part of the IEP goals. What is your child interested in? You know, and so this is an interest inventory, both for sports and physical education. I think getting that from parents also gives them voice as well. These are the things I'd like to see my child involved in or having access to. And we'll keep scrolling down with this.
That's the end there.
That's the end. Okay. So this is just a little bit of a tool. And what I liked about within this, the key things is interest. what is it? So we're getting information from you and the child. B, that assessment should be a complete picture and not just one picture. So if we're looking at addressing all of those 5 standards, we want to see what the social skills, the physical skills, the tactical as in moving skills are, and the fitness skills are, and not just one motor skill assessment, because that's only going to give us one slice. All right, I think, and we can share that with you. And again, we're looking forward to this discussion. I want to thank Becki for her expertise and her input with the IEP process. She may be able to answer a lot of the questions that you have, but you know, other successes, barriers, questions, we want to thank you. And also Carrie, for the opportunity to present to you. We're here to support you, and we really want the best for your child.
Thank you, Michelle and Becki. In the assessments, is there a live link to the assessments in the slides that you just presented? Is that a live link?
There is not a live link, but if you give us a little bit of time, we can create links to those, live links to those assessments.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you. And then there was a question in regards to if other organizations outside of school, such as Little League, need to provide an accommodation, such as different pitching, mething, or hitting off the tee for a child who is unable to participate traditionally. So here, I think it's important to differentiate between IDEA and the ADA. So IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and that's what outlines your child's rights for special education within your school setting, but it is within your school setting only. So anything that your child gets on an IEP does not equate to your child getting it outside of school for any sort of Girl Scouts, Little Leagues, recreational activities that aren't aligned with the school. Even rec programs, it can be very confusing to parents who have their child enrolled in rec programs, because oftentimes they take place in the school, but they're private programs that are contracting usually with the public school setting to use that building. And so they're not associated, or they're not mandated to follow IDEA. That being said, there's the ADA, the American with Disabilities Act, and this prevents your child or anybody with a disability from being discriminated against. And what that means is that if there's an accommodation that needs to be made for your child to participate, then that accommodation needs to be made. And I'll share this story with you. Not only am I a parent of a child with a disability, probably saw Sammy jump in here. She has Down syndrome, she's 13. But I'm also a sibling to a brother who unfortunately passed away at the young age of 16, but he had a heart condition that was undiagnosed and was on the golf team. And he was unable to walk the golf course with his golf bag like his fellow teammates. And that was one of the mandates to play on the golf team, is you had to walk the course, much like the professional golfing association that we see, the PGA. And so my parents they live in Massachusetts, and they wrote the Massachusetts Principals Association, and they were declined. So they filed a civil lawsuit with the Office of Civil Rights under the ADA, saying that they were discriminating against him because he had a disability and he was unable to participate without a golf cart. And they won, and he participated with his team, and that golf cart was his accommodation. So, and that was school-based. That was still school-based. But he didn't qualify for special education because his disability was physical. So they had to go the ADA route, and that was an outside of school. But that would apply to your child with a disability outside of school. You would use the American with Disabilities Act in Section 504. So even though we have 504s in school, it's important to remember that Section 504 actually falls under the Americans with Disability Act, and that's what helps to provide your children when they pursue post-secondary education, possibly at a college, or an employment situation outside of college, or independent living situation. Section 504 is what outlines the accommodations and modifications that needs to be provided to your young adult or child outside of school. So we do a large presentation on IEPs and the difference between Section 504, but if there are any other questions or concerns about that, you can feel free to call our offices and we'll provide some further clarification. I don't know if you have anything else to offer, Michelle and Becki, on that subject.
Hard to top that. Carrie, you did a great job with that. I'd be curious with some of those resources as well, just to support those. But I think, yeah, making those distinctions between ADA and IDEA in school. And unfortunately, you had to learn the hard way, but we look at those lawsuits as ways to make changes. So thank you for that. That's great.
And we have our question earlier, the individual followed up and he said, in regards to recreational therapy, he or she, sorry, it's an anonymous individual. If the school designates the service, are they still responsible for that community collaboration? I have heard of resistance of IEP teams recommending that service. Seems especially important for adolescents to access community programs for lifelong physical literacy.
Can you repeat that question one more time, Carrie?
Yep. So if the school designates the service, are they still responsible for that community collaboration? I have heard of resistance of IEP teams recommending that service. Seems especially important for adolescents to access community programs for lifelong physical literacy.
And Becki, maybe you can speak to that. I think the whole notion of transition services as well, how this can fall under when you're looking at, adolescents and transitioning out of high school and accessing community programs. So I'm going to defer to Becki on that and see what kind of input she has.
I would say the same thing. It sounds like it's part of the transition program. And I'm fortunate, just for an example, to have a pool facility as part of our high school. And so that's kind of an exposure to that, an example of an exposure to a community type programming and accessing a facility like the Y. I might also think about exposure to a fitness facility, a gym, and part of that, again, the transition programming as we begin to think about those 16-year-olds and adding that as part of their IEP.
So I think it's important to remember too that transition planning can start at the age of 14 or freshman year, whichever comes first. So my daughter's going to be 14 in 8th grade, and we're already talking transition planning. And that transition planning has a whole section on community-based service, independent living skills, and that is where you see more integration with community in schools. Prior to transition planning, it's a little bit more challenging to get the integration with the community-based services in the schools, and that's because of what I just outlined. The IEP an IDA does not protect you for outside of school activities. I think one of the things that has been most frustrating for families is like some of the recreational programs. What has happened for some of our students is because they're in school buildings, if an ed tech or if they have an aide is bringing them down to that after school activity, we've experienced the recreation program saying, well, then they need to have a one-to-one aide for our program too. And technically speaking, it's a violation of FERPA if you want to get technical about it. But because the ed tech brought the student down, now they know that the child has an aide and now they're requiring it for their program. And they're a private program. And so there's not and it becomes dependent on the family to provide that aid. And there's not a whole lot of recourse for families in that situation. And a lot of times what we help families navigate is, can you give the child a chance, because this is a recreational program, not a school. And so oftentimes you're not asking the child to do activities that are not preferred like a school is. And their reasoning for having an aide could be very different for them in school than it is for your programming. So we try to advocate in that way, shape, or form, but it can be very frustrating with families to advocate for their needs of a child in a private setting, and that's where we fall on the ADA a lot.
Imagine.
So do our disabled kids get measured under the Physical Fitness Award?
Becki, I'm going to have you speak to that and whether even those whether schools are still testing in that way or assessing in that way.
We're really not. My district, at least, is not. Maine Learning Results does still include physical fitness assessment over the course of time, but it's geared towards personal goals and creating programs to address personal goals and improving fitness. The important thing I think to note in the case of children with disabilities is that if a assessment is used across the board district-wide at grade level intervals or every grade, that there is the Brockport tests for a physical fitness test for students with disabilities that has many comparable components, but can also have additional components that might be specific to students' needs based on their disability. So I suggest accessing that in the general ed setting. And that's where my communication with the general ed PE teacher is important, that consultation. Providing the modifications and the alternative assessments within the general ed setting when that class would typically be participating in their physical fitness assessments.
Yeah, and typically we use the fitnessgram for our elementary PE teachers, well, it starts at 10, will be using the fitnessgram as part of their fitness assessment, but no, it's norm-based, it's also gender-based. So for us, it gives us a baseline of our child's fitness, and it's not so much, the percent where they fall, but it's more an assessment of what the child's physical fitness can be. It can also be used as part of the IEP if you're using the fitnessgram with sort of modifications and or the Brockport. But schools in general have moved away from the presidential physical fitness test, simply because it's the haves and the have-nots, and it doesn't really get at what we're trying to do in physical education.
So before we completely wrap up, you might see I've launched a poll. Being a nonprofit organization that is federally funded, it's important for us to be able to get feedback from all of you. So if you could take some time while we continue to field some questions, please feel free to still use the question and answer or chat box to ask questions. We'll still field those questions. If you could just take some quick time to fill out that poll, we would really appreciate it. I just wanted to also emphasize, and Becki spoke about this a little bit, the consult time with general education setting teachers, I think, are going to be really, really important part of the IEP process moving out of this pandemic. To get access to that least restrictive environment for your child, again, and Michelle and Becki did a great job of describing least restrictive environment. It's different in every single setting for your child, and your child, regardless of their ability, should have some type of interaction with their mainstream typically peers during the course of the day. And that's going to take a lot of collaboration between special educators and mainstream educators. And getting that written into the IEP is a really important piece of advocating for your child, because what it means is your special education teacher will have the ability to speak with the general education teachers, regardless of what subject matter, with every subject matter. When you get to the middle school levels, you end up getting many more teachers. So it does become a little bit more convoluted and difficult. But that type of collaboration can be as simple as emails, so that your special education teacher has an idea as to what is going to be presented in the general education setting in the upcoming weeks. Because really it's the job of the special education teacher or the adaptive physical education teacher to provide those accommodations and modifications so that your child has access to that mainstream classroom as much as possible, or general education setting as much as possible. And so providing those accommodations and modifications so it runs kind of seamlessly is what's really, really important. And getting it written into the IEP means that it will happen. If a district is telling you, oh yeah, we'll consult, well, teachers get busy and they're really busy right now. And so that transition to in-person learning, I think that's going to be a really important service to get added to IEPs if you want your child to have access.
And I want to just add something to that, Carrie. Oftentimes, I can't speak because I don't have a child with disability, but we think that our child needs to fit in, and part of that silo, but that is not the case. So we have the context of the physical education environment, and what, again, can that teacher and or the environment provide? So it's more of a social, not a social model, but really it is about your child, but it's also about context. And so you can reach out to me if you're like, what are the type of supports that we, and or Becki, what are the type of supports that we can provide and or education that we can provide in the physical education setting? So for example, are there peer supports? Are those being utilized? Does your child enter with everybody else at the same time? Where are they sitting? Is there equipment that they can access that's not one piece of equipment for 25 children? Is there multiple equipment? And again, can we consider factors within the environment that can support your child? Because it's not a question of your child fitting in, but it's a question of the environment accommodating your child. And I just want to reinforce that. That we are moving forward to make the environment more accessible for student differences.
I'm going to I'm going to put up the opening page of the presentation again, so that our email addresses are there. I know that it's also being recorded.
Yeah, and I want to thank Becki for her expertise, and I want to thank Carrie for the opportunity, and all of you parents out there, as we move forward into this transition time.
Thank you, Michelle and Becki, so much for being with us today and volunteering your time to make our kickoff to the conference a wonderful start. We're getting some feedback that all the information has been really helpful. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Grenier, Becki, and Carrie. Great information and very helpful. Thank you. Great information. Thank you all. We'll hang on for a few more minutes if there's any additional questions, but otherwise this would end our webinar for today. We do have Gear Parent Network is putting on their webinar this afternoon at 1 p.m. If you haven't registered, you can do so at Gear Parent Network if that's something that interests you. We'll have 2 sessions tomorrow, again, 9 and 1, and then Tuesday and Wednesday of next week, we have 4 additional sessions at 9 and 1. So you can check out both Gear Parent Network and Maine Parent Federation's websites for those webinars if you're interested in joining. So thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Great, thanks. Should we sign off now, Carrie?
Yeah, I think you're good.
Good.
I don't see any other questions coming in.
So we can send that Google, well, we can get you the slides. I will try to